Bibliophiles of the internet. We are currently in the middle of Latina Heritage Month, and I'm here to recommend a bunch of Latina books written by Latina authors. Now, obviously, Latina identity and literature is very expansive. This is not intended to be a comprehensive or exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. Trust me, if I had all the time and energy and resources in the world, I would recommend you so many more books than just this. Just as a quick note as to how this list is organized, today I'm doing things by categories. Some categories are age groups, some are genres, some are based on format. I just figured that would make the most sense so that I could share as wide a variety of books as I can in this somewhat limited space. Also, if you're wondering about my credentials, if this is the first time you're seeing me, hello, I am a real-life queer, trans, non-binary, Mexican-American reader and book reviewer. I've been doing this for close to 12 years, and understatement of the century, in those 12 years, I have read a lot of Latina books. Diving right in, we're actually going to start with picture books, which is not my usual purview, but here we are anyways. I'm going to start with Gustavo the Shy Ghost, written and illustrated by Flavia Z. Drago. This is a super cute story about this shy little ghost named Gustavo who just wants to make friends, but it's really hard for him because obviously no one can see him as a ghost. But as Dia de Muertos is getting closer and closer, he is determined to do something to get the other monsters to finally notice him so that he can share this holiday that he loves. I sincerely love this picture book. It's one of my favorite picture books to give to the kids and parents in my life. The illustrations are so vibrant and so beautiful, and it's just a really sweet story about putting yourself out there, sharing what you love, and making new friends. I think biographical picture books are also really great, and I would definitely suggest Planting Stories, written by Annika Aldamoy Denise and illustrated by Paula Escobar. This is the story of Pura Belpre's life. If you're somehow not familiar with her work, Pura Belpre was New York City's first Puerto Rican librarian, and she was a huge champion for bilingual literature and, of course, putting bilingual books on shelves. Again, I think this is a really wonderful way to learn more about Pura Belpre's life and legacy, which continues on to this day. A more recent release to check out is When We Find Her, written by M. Garcia Peña and illustrated by Andres Ciolin. This is a really beautiful and touching story about grief. It follows a young girl named Laila and her abuelo who miss her abuela very dearly after her recent passing because everything without her just feels different. So Laila decides that she and her abuelo will make her abuela's signature dish, sancocho, to honor her memory and keep her love alive. I love the concept of this picture book. Even though it's not strictly a Dia de Muertos story, I feel like it ties into those traditions and beliefs very closely. I love how it shows the importance of memory and family tradition as a way to both feel and share love for those who are no longer with us. Speaking of Dia de Muertos, I would also recommend The Ofrenda That We Built by Jolene and Cheyenne Gutierrez, illustrated by Gabi Zapata. This is such a gorgeous and heartfelt picture book that teaches young readers about Dia de Muertos and the tradition surrounding the holiday, specifically the tradition of building an ofrenda and the meaning behind all the different details and symbols that go into that process. I actually got to meet the illustrator last year at ALA, and she was so incredibly lovely. I got the book signed by her and I gifted it to one of my nibblings. It's such a thoughtful, informative, and really wonderful book. Next, I thought I would talk about some novels in verse. The first book I want to recommend in this category is Ivelisse Explains It All by Andrea Beatriz Arango. All of Andrea's books so far have been middle grade novels in verse, and I would highly recommend each and every one of them, but I definitely fell in love with her writing in this debut novel in verse, so I thought I would show it some more love. This is an incredibly moving story about grappling with mental health. It's about a girl named Ivelisse who is determined to make 7th grade her year. She wants to navigate her PTSD better, she wants to make new friends, and she wants to help her grandmother adjust after moving from Puerto Rico to the States. This story doesn't shy away from how different generations, especially in Latina cultures, have very different experiences with and perceptions of mental health. That is really the heart of this story, and it's incredibly powerful to see Ivelisse navigating all of that complexity and learning how to express what it is she truly needs. This next book is very popular, but I haven't talked about it in a while, even though I think about it all the time, and that is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a YA novel in verse about a young Afro-Latina poet named Xiomara who feels very little control over her body and her life, and she also has a very tense relationship with her mother who is very conservative and ultra-Catholic. When Xiomara is invited to join her school's slam poetry club, she knows that her mother will never give her permission to go, so if she wants to keep writing and performing her poems, she might have to break some rules. Every amazing thing you've heard about this book is absolutely true. It's powerful, it's poignant, it's fearless, it's not afraid to pick apart the oppressive ideologies of Catholicism, which are so often tied up in Latina cultural beliefs and practices, and it's just such an empowering story, especially for teens who are trying to find their voice. A lesser-known novel in verse that I would suggest is Enchanted Air by Margarita Engel. This is actually a middle-grade memoir in verse that shares the story of Margarita's upbringing because she grew up between both Cuban and American culture as the Cold War was was unfolding and as revolution was breaking out in Cuba. I think for younger readers especially, this is a really great story to learn more about the Cold War era and the impacts of the Cold War. And because Margarita is caught between two of the warring countries, physically, culturally, and emotionally, her story offers a very unique perspective. My next category is short story collections, and the first one I'm going to talk about is on my own long-term TBR. That is A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez, translated by Megan McDowell from the original Spanish. Short story collections are notoriously impossible to summarize, but I'm going to do my best. All of these stories are set in Argentina. They're described as stories about ordinary people, especially women whose lives are turned upside down when they encounter terror, the surreal, and the supernatural. Honestly, that's all I need to know, and if you've already read this, the good news is that Mariana has another short story collection that was recently published in English. That is Somebody is Walking on Your Grave, and that recently came out on September 30th. The next collection I would suggest is Craft, Stories I Wrote for the Devil by Ananda Lima. This is another horror-adjacent collection, and I believe while each story stands on its own, they're kind of held together by a narrative through line, which is that there was a Halloween party in 1999 where a writer slept with the devil himself, and now he continuously appears and reappears throughout her life, and to appease him, she writes him stories. I've heard really great things about this, and from what I understand, it also creates a narrative bridge between the US and Brazil, so I'm definitely curious. Lastly, another collection from my TBR that I would suggest is The Rock Eaters by Brenda Peinado. You may have heard me talk about Brenda Peinado before. I love to recommend her sci-fi novella, Time's Agent, whenever I can, but this is her short story collection that is said to span worlds and dimensions using strange and speculative elements to tackle everything from class differences to immigration to xenophobic experiences. The book description says that each of the stories in this collection are asking the question of what does it mean to be other, and what does it mean to love in a world that is determined to keep us apart, which I think sounds fantastic. Next, I want to recommend some middle grade books. A few of the titles I've already mentioned are also middle grade. I should have said at the top that these are not discrete categories. There's definitely some overlap between them. But with that said, I definitely recommend Pilar Ramirez and the Escape from Zafa by Julian Randall. This is the first book in a completed middle grade fantasy duology. It follows a young Dominican American girl named Pilar who's noticed that her mom and her abuela have an unspoken code of silence when it comes to her cousin Natasha, who disappeared 50 years ago during the Trujillo dictatorship. So when Pilar hears that one of her sister's college professors actually studies disappearances from that time period, she hops on a train, starts snooping around this professor's office, and finds a folder with her cousin's name on it. But when she opens it, she falls into a blank page and emerges in a completely different fantasy world. This is such a fun, inventive, adventurous middle grade fantasy series that is also able to incorporate Dominican mythology and history into the story in really thoughtful ways. Another middle grade series I don't talk about nearly enough is the Ceci Rios series, which begins with Ceci Rios and the Desert of Souls by Kayla Rivera. This is another middle grade fantasy story set in a version of our world where there are monsters known as criaturas, powerful spirits, who roam the desert and threaten humans with their existence. The main character, Ceci, has always been curious about this world of criaturas and brujeria, and when her older sister is suddenly kidnapped by a powerful criatura known as El Sombreron, Ceci knows that she'll have to quickly become a bruja herself if she wants to get her sister back. Regretfully, I have not yet continued on with this series, but I did really love the first book. My next category is young adult, even though again you will definitely find YA books in different sections of this video. But I'm going to start off by once again recommending Libertad by Bessie Flores Zaldivar. This is a queer YA coming-of-age story set against the backdrop of the rigged Honduran presidential election that took place in 2017. The main character, Libertad, is determined to keep both her queerness and the radical poetry she writes a secret from the rest of her family and her friends. But as the upcoming election starts fanning the flames of revolution and it comes to light that her older brother might be taking part in some very dangerous protests, things go from bad to worse in her house when Libertad's mom also finds text messages on her phone about how she's been kissing girls. I talk about this book all the time. I recommend this book all the time. I think it is so dramatically underread and underrated, but it's such a powerful story that has so much to say about how demanding that something or someone becomes better is a tremendous act of bravery and love. So if you haven't read this yet, please read it. Next, I'd like to recommend a recent release that is The Golden Boy's Guide to Bipolar by Sonora Reyes. This is a companion novel to The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School, although you could technically read both of them on their own as well. It's another queer coming-of-age story about a young Mexican Mexican-American teenager named Cesar who's considered to be the golden boy of the family. He's incredibly smart, he doesn't have to try very hard to get good grades, but he's also struggling with his mental health, especially his potential bipolar diagnosis. But he's working with a new therapist, he's trying a new regimen of meds, and as the chronic overachiever that he is, he feels like now he has everything under control and it's the perfect time to both come out and also try to win back his ex. I recently reviewed this in my July wrap-up, so definitely check that out if you want to hear some more in-depth thoughts. But this is such an invaluable story, especially in the YA space, not only showing the complexity of sitting at the intersection between race, queerness, and mental illness, but also validating how mental health and mental diagnoses are not linear and also not cut and paste one-size-fits-all experiences. I haven't talked about this one in a while, but I would also recommend Flawless Girls by A.M. McLemore. This is an interesting blend of dark academia, magical realism, and even horror. It's about two Latina sisters whose grandmother wants them to have the very best proper education, and so they're sent to this prestigious boarding school known as Alari House, which is known for churning out proper young ladies and famous socialites. The younger sister, Isla, doesn't even last a single day, and when her sister, Renata, visits home after a few months, Isla realizes that she's unnervingly polite and possibly murderous. Renata actually ends up vanishing, and Isla decides to return to Alari House to figure out what exactly they did to her sister and whether there's a way to undo whatever's been done. This is very different from what A.M. McLemore has written in the past, especially in the YA space, and I really enjoyed it. It's creepy, it's unsettling, it's dark, and it really challenges the concept of propriety, social norms, and gender roles, especially from a queer Latina perspective. Staying in the creepy vein, next I'd like to recommend some horror books, starting with Our Share of Night by Marian Enriquez, once again translated by Megan McDowell from the original Spanish. This is a big, girthy horror story about a deceased woman whose husband and son set out on a road trip to her ancestral home where they will finally have to confront her estranged family, which might be more of a death cult. This cult performs unspeakable acts in their desperate search for immortality, and they believe that this woman's son, Gaspar, is destined to become their next leader as foretold by fate. I think about this book all the time. It's such a perplexing puzzle box of a story that very slowly untangles itself and reveals itself to the reader as the story progresses. And I also think it's really cool that each section of the book is almost modeled after a different horror trope, like the haunted house, the home intruder, the cursed forest, so on and so forth. It's just epic in every way that a story can be epic. Then I have to once again recommend one of my all-time favorite books, This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. This is a mindfucky cosmic horror story that also folds in a little bit of tech horror in there as well. It follows a man named Tiago who is grieving his late wife, and he believes that the smart speaker they bought after moving into their new apartment is to blame for her death. Not only did they start feeling cold spots and hearing scratching in the walls, but then strange packages neither of them ordered would show up on their doorstep. Music would start playing without any prompting. Lights would start projecting in the middle of the night. And now, even though Tiago is moving far away, these strange occurrences seem to be following him and feeding off his grief. This is a book that I truly cannot shake. I've gushed about it so many times, but suffice to say it's cerebral, it's deeply psychological, and it provides a terrifyingly refreshing take on the concept of being haunted in so many ways. Lastly, for this category, I would also recommend The Devil Takes You Home by Gavino Iglesias. If you love S.A. Cosby, you need to be reading Gavino Iglesias because their stories absolutely share DNA. This is definitely an incredibly dark and intense story, so I would suggest checking out content warnings and treading lightly, but I think it also blends horror and crime thriller in really fascinating ways. The story follows a grieving father whose young daughter just passed away after struggling with illness, which has left the main character overwhelmed with medical debt that he cannot pay. So he decides to take a lucrative but dangerous job as a hitman where he will have to hijack a cash shipment from a cartel before it reaches Mexico. Like I said, this is definitely a dark, fucked up, nihilistic story, but even though it's extremely violent, that violence is almost grounded in a sense of realism in that the story is shedding light on very real kinds of violence that already exist in the world. And then of course that gets tangled up in the supernatural as well. On a completely different note, my next category is romance, and I'm going to start with a recently completed companion trilogy that I really enjoyed, and the first book in that trilogy is Ana Maria and the Fox by Liana de la Rosa. This is the first book in a historical romance series following three Mexican sisters known as the Luna Sisters, whose parents are very politically active in Mexico, which is currently currently being occupied by the French. So in order to get their daughters far away from the war and also leverage their high social standing to help establish new contacts and allies abroad, the sisters are sent to London, where they are not so warmly welcomed by the noble class. Each book in this trilogy follows one of the sisters as they try to establish a place for themselves in the world and accidentally find love in the process. I finished off this series very recently and would definitely recommend each and every book in this trilogy, especially if you love historical romance. It's not often that we see meaningful Mexican representation in historical romance specifically, and these were all just so refreshing and fun to read. Speaking of Latina historical romance, I would also suggest checking out A Caribbean Heiress in Paris by Adriana Herrera. This companion series has been on my TBR for quite some time. I believe this first book is about Luz, who is a Dominican heiress to a rum empire who decides to leave Santo Domingo for Paris with the intention of expanding the rum business that her family has built over 3 generations. But when she gets there, not only is she not taken seriously as a woman of color, but she also doesn't have access to her inheritance until and unless she marries. Then she runs into the Earl of Darnick, who is attempting to build a successful whiskey brand himself, and even though they're technically competition, they find themselves drawn to each other despite their better judgment. Like I said, these books have been on my radar for quite some time. I've heard really lovely things about all 3 books, and I've never met an Adriana Herrera romance that I did not like. Lastly, I thought I would share a YA romance, and that is Flirting with Fate by J.C. Cervantes. This sounds like a really sweet YA romance about a girl named Ava who unfortunately was not able to make it to her grandmother's deathbed before she passed because she got caught in an unexpected flash flood that caused her to get into a car crash. In her family, it's been said that the older generations bestow a magical blessing upon their passing, which Ava obviously missed. But then her grandmother appears from beyond the grave and tells Ava that she did pass along a blessing, but it was mistakenly bestowed upon the mysterious boy who Ava crashed into during the storm. So along with her sisters, the ghost of her grandmother, and a bumbling spirit guide, Ava will have to find a way to befriend this boy and straighten out this cosmic mistake. I actually found this while I was doing research for this video, and I just think it sounds really fun. I love when romances explore love of family and culture alongside romantic love, and I think this has the potential to be super, super cute. Next, I'm going to talk about nonfiction and nonfiction essays, starting off with a couple of recent favorites. First up, So Many Stars by Quero de Robertes. This is an oral history of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of color. The author was actually part of an oral history project led by Jacqueline Woodson, who founded this fellowship where she selected 10 writers to gather oral histories of elders of color from across the United States. So Quero de Robertes was named as one of those fellows, and they decided to focus on queer and trans elders of the West Coast. This book is a transcription of the in-person interviews conducted by the author, and it's a collection of queer and trans elders of color talking about their lived experiences in their own words. This is such a powerful collection of interviews. So often these kinds of histories and accounts of history are erased or lost, and there's something really beautiful about having all of these personal stories collected in one place. Another of my favorite nonfiction books I've read this year is Alligator Tears by Edgar Gomez. This is Edgar's second memoir. They also wrote High Risk Homosexual, which I also highly recommend. But this new essay collection explores their upbringing with a focus on his family's experience of poverty and how having to navigate a very inaccessible world influenced the way that Edgar grew up and also intersected with their experiences of Latinidad and queerness. As far as memoirs go, this one is truly masterful. The way that Edgar connects all these disparate experiences with a consistent through line of debunking myths and stereotypes about poverty and how the American dream is nothing more than an elaborate hoax is nothing short of brilliant, in my opinion. It's been a while since I talked about this next collection, but I definitely recommend My Time Among the Whites by Jeanine Capot Cruzet. Jeanine Capot Cruzet is the child of Cuban refugees, born and raised in Miami, Florida. These essays explore how the author came to understand the contours of American identity, especially through navigating overwhelmingly white spaces, and how her family's attempts to assimilate as a way to survive were doomed from the very start. This is an incredibly sharp and insightful collection of essays. I really appreciate how the author articulates that BIPOC folks are expected to navigate, assimilate to, and subvert whiteness all at the same time, which of course, by design, is an impossible tightrope to walk. Next up, let's talk about even more queer books. First, if you haven't already, you really need to read 1500 Miles from the Sun by Johnny Garzavilla. Some of Johnny's most recent books have found a great deal of well-deserved success, but I think their debut deserves even more love. This is a YA contemporary romance about a Mexican-American boy named Jules who is determined to get into UCLA, graduate, and leave Corpus Christi, Texas behind so he can finally come out and be himself. Even though he has no plans of sharing his queerness before he graduates and moves moves away, he gets a little too drunk at a party and accidentally outs himself in a tweet. But on the upside, there's a boy named Matt from LA who is Jules's longtime Twitter crush, and Jules's accidental coming out gives him the push he needs to finally slide into Jules's DMs, and then they eventually decide to give this long-distance relationship a chance. I love this book so much. Not only is it a great coming-of-age story with a really wonderful, supportive, boisterous friend group at the center, but it's also such a beautiful depiction of a long-distance relationship that shows how distance or proximity has very little bearing on the impact of a truly meaningful connection. If you've been here for a while, you have definitely heard me talk about this next book, and I'm still on hands and knees begging people to please give it a chance. That is The Best Bad Things by Katrina Carrasco. This is a blend of historical fiction, crime fiction, and queer fiction. It's about a queer Mexican character known as Alma, who is basically a secret agent of sorts. She was formally trained in espionage by the Pinkerton Detective Agency, but she was actually dismissed from her post because she's notorious for going undercover and disguising herself as a man named Jack Camp. Luckily, Alma is able to pick up some work with a woman named Delphine, who is the mastermind behind the West Coast smuggling ring, and Alma is assigned to investigate some product that's gone missing up in Washington. So disguising herself once again as Jack, a scrappy dock worker, she hopes to get to the bottom of things. I constantly refer to this as one of the most deliciously gender-fucky books I've ever read, and I fully stand by that statement to this day. This first book especially is just a bisexual fever dream in the best possible way, as Jack uses every and any advantage to try and crack this case. It is fantastic. Another book I haven't talked about in a while is actually a translated YA book called Where We Go From Here by Lucas Rocha. This is a contemporary YA story set in Brazil and following three gay friends whose lives become intertwined in the face of an unexpected HIV diagnosis. One of the characters, Victor, is getting tested for HIV because his current partner is HIV positive but did not disclose that until after they had sex. And while he's at the clinic, he meets another guy named Ian who's also getting tested, and Ian's test actually does come back positive. So Victor offers to connect Ian with his partner, Enrique, so that he can get some firsthand guidance as to how to navigate this diagnosis, and the three of them end up becoming unlikely friends. What I really appreciate about this story is that its intention is to not only destigmatize HIV/AIDS, which is still a very pervasive disease, but also to bring our understanding of that disease out from the past and into the present. Not only is it vital that we remember the very recent history of the HIV/AIDS crisis, but we have to remember that it's something a lot of people are still living with, and I love how the story explores that reality through a distinctively Latina perspective. I could share so many more categories than just this, and trust me, I very seriously considered it, but the last category for today in this video is historical fiction. Again, I've definitely tucked in a bunch of historical fiction recs in other categories, but I'm gonna once again start by recommending an all-time favorite book, and that is Cantoras by Quero de Robertes. This is set in Uruguay during the 1970s when a military government was ruling the country with an iron fist, and during that time period, homosexuality was seen as a dangerous transgression that could get you captured, imprisoned, or even killed. The story follows 5 queer women who call themselves cantoras, meaning women who sing, as a sort of code name for themselves, and together they discover this isolated cape where they can escape together and safely be their true selves. Obviously, the story goes from there, but this is definitely one of the most beautiful and deeply emotional stories I've ever read. It very realistically explores this dangerous political moment in Uruguayan history, but it also leaves space for hope and space for showing how these women are still strong, vibrant, and incredibly, irrefutably alive, despite the circumstances. It's been a second since I recommended this next book, but I still definitely recommend The Air You Breathe by Francis de Pontes Peebles. This is a queer historical story that begins in Brazil during the 1930s, following a young girl named Dores who works in the kitchen of a sugar plantation. And when she meets the wealthy, spoiled daughter of the sugar baron, Gracia, they quickly become friends and bond very deeply over their shared love of music. Gracia is an incredibly talented singer, and it turns out that Dores has a knack for composing music and lyrics, so eventually they decide to leave the plantation behind for Rio de Janeiro, where they try to make it as professional chambistas, even though their polar opposite attitudes will push them together and pull them apart countless times as the years progress. If you love messy, dramatic, emotionally entangled stories about fame and the golden age of Hollywood, then you need to read this. If you enjoyed something like The Seventh Veil of Salome, or as much as I didn't like it, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, you need to read this. this. Those two examples are more focused on the acting side of Hollywood, whereas this story obviously is more about music. But this is truly such an ambitious historical epic that beautifully depicts an unfolding saga of love, rivalry, and loss across decades and decades. Lastly, you didn't think I would make it through this video or this section without recommending The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Quesada. Did you? That's right, I'm back at it again. This is another one of my all-time favorite books. It's another queer historical fiction story set in the Harlem Ball scene back in 1980s New York. While the story follows a few different characters, it begins with a drag queen known as Angel, who is new to ball culture and wants to help create a sense of family for those without, much like herself. She eventually falls in love with a dancer named Hector, and together they form the House of Extravaganza, which is the first ever all-Latina house in the history of the Harlem ball circuit. Much like many of my favorite historical fiction books, not only is this story reclaiming and celebrating really important queer history, especially in the way that it honors Black and brown trans women and drag queens who have always been at the forefront of our liberation, but it's also just an incredibly beautiful, tender, thoughtful story about how special it is to not only find our place in the world, but make our place in the world. So there you have it. Those are a ton of different Latina books across age ranges, genres, and formats that you can enjoy and check out this Latina Heritage Month and all year long. Again, please don't take this as an exhaustive list, but if you have any other recs that you want to share with other folks, feel free to drop those down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.